poor student marries a 67-year-old millionaire. 3 days later, he broke out in a cold sweat when he saw Ethan Carter was a 22-year-old living in Chicago, widely recognized for his dedication to his studies and the promise of a bright future as an engineer. His life, however, took a tragic turn on a rainy night. He received the devastating news that his parents had been in a fatal car accident, leaving him alone to care for his 14-year-old sister, Lily. On top of dealing with their shared grief, Lily suffered from a heart condition that required constant and expensive medical care. The loss of their parents brought not only emotional pain but also the crushing burden of financial responsibility. Ethan discovered that his father had amassed significant debt, mortgaging the family home and taking out loans to maintain their standard of living. Now, Ethan had to juggle college, Lily's medical bills, and his late-night job at a supermarket. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Each day became a grueling blend of physical exhaustion and emotional despair. He managed only a few hours of sleep, studied during short breaks at work, and cared for his sister whenever he was home. Ethan was haunted by an ever-present sense of helplessness, but he never showed weakness around Lily. He knew she needed strength to weather the storm, even when he felt like he was drowning. One night, as he watched the dim glow of a bedside lamp illuminating Lily's sleeping face, Ethan made a vow to himself. He would do whatever it took to protect her. Little did he know, that promise would lead him down an even darker path. In the weeks following the accident, Ethan's routine morphed into an unrelenting cycle of exhaustion. He woke up early to review notes before his college classes, rushed from the university to his supermarket job, and worked until the early hours of the morning. Between the quiet aisles and shelves stocked with goods, he tried to distract himself from the weight pressing on his chest, but moments of stillness allowed the anxiety and emptiness to swallow him whole. Lily, on her part, did everything she could to help, but her fragile health made even simple tasks a challenge. Ethan insisted that she rest, knowing her efforts were her way of trying to ease his burden. Yet, deep down, this only intensified his feelings of responsibility. He shielded her from their financial struggles, never mentioning the relentless calls from debt collectors or the looming threat of losing their home. At college, Ethan struggled to focus. His professors noticed his exhaustion, and while some offered support, he avoided explaining his situation. The thought of exposing his vulnerabilities felt unbearable. He couldn't afford to fail. Every missed class or poorly scored exam was another obstacle to the future he was fighting to build for himself and Lily. One evening, while stocking canned goods in the supermarket's food aisle, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message. It was from a college friend, informing him that he had missed an important assignment deadline. Panic set in immediately. Cold sweat trickled down his back as he desperately tried to figure out how to fix his mistake, but his overloaded mind refused to cooperate. In that moment, Ethan realized his life was a tightrope walk where a single misstep could drag both him and Lily into the abyss. On his way home, under the dim glow of streetlights, Ethan felt crushed by the weight of his responsibilities. He carried bags of groceries, bought with the little that remained of his paycheck, each step feeling like a symbolic reminder of his struggle. When he entered the quiet house, he found Lily asleep on the couch, a thin blanket covering her legs. He approached and gently adjusted the blanket, a wave of guilt and love washing over him simultaneously. The physical and mental exhaustion was evident, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to give in to the fatigue. His life had become a fragile balancing act, where everything depended on his ability to endure. One morning, while Ethan was reviewing notes for an upcoming exam, the insistent ringing of the phone broke the silence in the house. He rushed to answer it, fearing it might be news about Lily's health. On the other end of the line, a deep and confident female voice introduced herself as Charlotte Hayes. Without preamble, she stated that she had a proposal that could solve all of his financial problems. Confused and cautious, Ethan tried to ask how she knew about his situation, but Charlotte cut him off. "I can't explain now, but you need to meet me at the Silver Bloom restaurant at 8 tonight. It's important. Don't miss it." Before he could respond or even process what was happening, she hung up. Ethan stood frozen, the phone still in his hand, his mind racing in circles. Who was this woman? How did she know about his life? And most importantly, why was she offering help? Despite the strangeness of the situation, the promise of a solution to his debts was tempting. Yet, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Throughout the day, he replayed the phone call in his mind, trying to piece together a logical explanation. Could it be some kind of scam? Maybe someone connected to the debt collectors? Or perhaps just a cruel prank? But Charlotte's voice had been so firm, so full of certainty, it seemed unlikely to be anything trivial. As the clock neared 8, Ethan made the decision to go to the meeting. Before leaving, he stopped by Lily's room to let her know, "I have something important to take care of. I'll be back soon. Take care." "Okay?" Lily, engrossed in a book, looked up at him with curiosity but didn't press for details. Ethan walked to the Silver Bloom, an upscale restaurant in the city center where he could never afford to dine. Wearing his best shirt plain and slightly faded, he felt out of place as he stepped through the glass doors and was greeted by a maitre d' who raised an eyebrow at him. "I'm here to see Charlotte Hayes," he said softly. The man led him to a table at the back, where a woman with impeccably styled gray hair awaited him. Charlotte radiated authority and mystery. Her piercing blue eyes studied him with keen interest as she gestured for him to sit down. "You must have a lot of questions, but I'll get straight to the point. I know you're drowning in debt and taking care of your sister alone. I can help you get out of this situation. I can pay for everything, Ethan. But there's one condition." The pause in her voice heightened the tension, and Ethan felt the air around him grow heavy. "You need to marry me." Ethan blinked, unable to believe what he had just heard. It was an absurd, surreal proposal that his mind couldn't process. He tried to ask why, but Charlotte simply offered an enigmatic smile and added, "Think of it as a contract. You get stability. I resolve something I need. I expect your answer tomorrow." Without giving him a chance to argue, she stood up and left, leaving Ethan with more questions than answers. The walk home was silent and bewildering. Charlotte's words echoed in Ethan's mind like an unsolvable riddle. He tried to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing added up. Why would a wealthy, seemingly powerful woman be interested in marrying someone like him, a young, debt-ridden student? When he got home, Ethan found Lily awake, lying on the couch and watching an old TV show. She sat up as soon as she noticed his expression, a mix of worry and curiosity crossing her face. "What's wrong, Ethan? Did something happen?" For a moment, he considered lying, saying it was nothing. But the need to share the weight of Charlotte's proposal overwhelmed him. He sat down beside her and explained what had happened, detailing every moment of the conversation at the restaurant. As he spoke, Lily's eyes widened, shifting between disbelief and concern. "She wants you to marry her? That doesn't make any sense, Ethan. You don't even know her." "I know, Lily. None of it makes sense." But she seemed serious, determined, and if it's true, it could solve our debts, could fix everything. You'd get the treatment you need, and I wouldn't have to work all night. But at the same time, it feels wrong. Lily's tense expression softened briefly as she thought it over. "Ethan, maybe this is our chance. Maybe this is what we need to get out of this mess. But what if it's dangerous? What if she has some bad intentions?" "I don't know." Ethan sighed, feeling the weight of the decision grow heavier. He needed another perspective. That's when he decided to call Ryan, his best friend and a law student. Not long after, Ryan arrived at the house, bringing with him a practical energy that seemed to cut through the heavy atmosphere in the room. "Let me get this straight," Ryan began after hearing Ethan's story. "She wants you to sign a marriage contract. That's unusual but not illegal. The problem is, No one does something like this without a reason. There are risks, Ethan. Legal risks, financial risks, even personal risks. You'd be stepping into uncharted territory. I know, Ryan, but what if it's real? What if she can actually pay off the debts? It would change everything. Yes, but at what cost? You'd be tied to someone who's clearly not being upfront about her intentions. What happens if you want out later? Or if something goes wrong? The conversation went on late into the night, with Ethan, Lily, and Ryan debating the possible consequences. Lily, despite her concern, couldn't hide the hope the proposal offered. Ryan, however, remained skeptical and urged Ethan to demand answers before making any decisions. As the night wore on and his friends said their goodbyes, Ethan sat alone in the dark living room, staring out the window. The city outside seemed quiet, but his mind was a storm. He knew that whatever choice he made would change his life forever. The next morning, Ethan woke after only a few hours of sleep. The weight of the decision still pressed heavily on his shoulders, but Charlotte's deadline was approaching quickly. He got dressed and decided to return to the Silver Bloom to give her his answer. On the way, he replayed the possibilities in his mind. Charlotte's promise seemed like a miraculous solution to his problems, but logic screamed that accepting something so unusual was dangerous. Walking into the restaurant for the second time, Ethan couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the opulence of the place and his own modest reality. He was led once again to the same table, where Charlotte was already waiting. She appeared calm, a cup of coffee before her, and a faint smile that only made Ethan more uneasy. "So, have you made your decision?" Charlotte asked, her tone direct and unyielding. Ethan took a deep breath. "I need to understand more. Why me? Why choose me, when you probably have so many other options?" Charlotte folded her hands on the table, leaning slightly toward him. "Because you have something I need. Your last name, your connection to the past. But also because I see potential in you, Ethan. You're young, resilient, and desperate. And desperation has its value." Her words carried a calculated coldness, and Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as she explained. "That's not enough," he said. "I can't just accept a deal like this without knowing more about your intentions." Charlotte tilted her head, studying him as if he were a pawn on a chessboard. "Very well. I had hoped your need would outweigh your hesitation. But if you want details, I'll tell you. Your grandfather, Charles Carter, was involved in business with my late husband. Those dealings left behind a web of legal and financial complications that I need to untangle, and you are the key to resolving them." Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. He barely remembered his grandfather, who had died when Ethan was still a child. The idea that something from his past could affect his life so drastically now felt absurd. And why marriage? Why not just resolve this some other way? Marriage ensures my position. It makes everything more efficient. Her smile was barely perceptible, but it was enough to unsettle Ethan. He hesitated, but the thought of Lily, fragile and dependent, weighed heavier than any of his doubts. He knew that, despite all the risks, refusing might mean losing what little he had left. Finally, he nodded, his throat tightening. "I accept." Charlotte's smile turned almost triumphant. "Very well. My lawyer will contact you tomorrow. Prepare yourself, Ethan. Your life is about to change." On the way home, Ethan felt torn between relief and fear. He knew he had crossed a line he could never uncross, but he convinced himself he was doing the best thing for his sister. The wedding ceremony took place with a speed and formality that left Ethan feeling uneasy. Charlotte seemed to have taken care of everything. The venue was a law office in downtown Chicago, elegant yet cold, with dark wood-paneled walls. Only her lawyer, 2 assistants, and a clerk from the registry office were present. Ethan wore a simple suit Charlotte had provided, while she, in stark contrast, wore a sophisticated but understated dress that highlighted her austere demeanor. The contract was placed in front of Ethan even before the traditional words were spoken. He felt the symbolic weight of the document, with its detailed and impersonal clauses. Charlotte watched him sign with the calm expression of someone completely in control, while Ethan, trying to ignore the sensation of selling his freedom, signed with trembling fingers. After the formalities, Charlotte shook his hand instead of kissing him, reinforcing the transactional nature of their arrangement. "Congratulations, Ethan. We're officially partners now." Her choice of words echoed in his mind, making it clear that the marriage was nothing more than a business deal. In the car on the way to Charlotte's mansion, Ethan stared out the window, trying to process the radical change that had just occurred in his life. Chicago blurred past him, but his mind was fixated on Lily. He needed to remind himself why he had made this decision. His sister's future depended on it. As the car pulled into Charlotte's estate, Ethan was struck by the sheer scale of the property. The mansion was an imposing structure, surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens that felt devoid of life. Everything about the place exuded wealth, but it also carried an oppressive emptiness. Charlotte stepped out of the car with her usual composure, while Ethan hesitated for a moment before following her. Inside, the mansion was even more opulent. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, and the marble floors reflected the lights like a cold mirror. A team of impeccably uniformed staff stood in a discreet line in the entrance hall. They bowed their heads slightly as Charlotte passed but avoided looking at Ethan. He realized immediately that he would always be an outsider in this place. Charlotte gave quick instructions to the butler, James, a man with a stern expression and rigid posture, and then turned to Ethan. "You'll have your room in the East Wing. Meals are served at the usual times. If you need anything, ask James. And one last thing, there are areas in the mansion that are off-limits to you. I trust you'll respect that." Without waiting for a reply, she ascended the grand staircase, leaving Ethan alone in the vast hall. He stood still for a moment, feeling the oppressive weight of his surroundings. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the faint sound of footsteps from a distant servant. James approached, his expression as serious as ever, and said, "I'll escort you to your room, Mr. Carter." Ethan followed the butler through long, dimly lit corridors. The room assigned to him was spacious but cold, furnished with antique, neutral-colored pieces. It felt more like a guest room than a welcoming space. Once he was finally alone, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and let out a deep sigh. He knew this was a new chapter in his life, but everything about this place made him feel like he had entered a strange and dangerous world. Ethan's first days in the mansion were marked by an overwhelming sense of isolation. He wandered through the expansive, shadowy corridors, surrounded by old portraits and furniture that seemed to belong to another century. The staff were polite but distant, answering his questions briefly and keeping interactions to a minimum. He noticed that none of them ever looked him directly in the eye, as if his presence was uncomfortable or unwelcome. Charlotte, meanwhile, remained busy with meetings and obligations Ethan didn't fully understand. She rarely sought him out, and when she did, their interactions were brief and to the point. It was as if she were testing his patience or waiting for him to make a mistake. On the third night, while exploring the mansion, Ethan noticed that some doors were locked. This piqued his curiosity, especially when he realized the staff seemed to avoid those areas. Once, as he walked down a corridor leading to one of these doors, he heard faint whispers coming from the other side. When he moved closer, the sounds stopped abruptly, leaving him on edge. Ethan began noticing other strange details. During dinner, often served to him alone, he caught the staff exchanging furtive glances, as if something was being deliberately hidden from him. The mansion's lights frequently flickered, despite the luxurious setting. Even the silence seemed to carry an unusual weight, as if the very air was thick with tension. The next morning, as Ethan sipped his coffee on the back veranda, he noticed James, the butler, approaching with an expression even more serious than usual. "I must remind you, Mr. Carter, that there are rules here. Exploring restricted areas can lead to undesirable consequences." Ethan looked up, surprised and unsettled. "I didn't realize I was doing anything wrong. I was just walking around the house." James maintained his rigid posture, but there was something in his eyes, perhaps a warning, or even a hint of sympathy. "Some things are better left as they are. I suggest you enjoy your stay and respect the boundaries." Without waiting for a reply, the butler walked away, leaving Ethan feeling more uneasy than before. That night, he decided to dig deeper. He waited until the staff had retired and, with cautious steps, began exploring the less frequented corridors. He stopped in front of one of the locked doors and pressed his ear against it, straining to hear any sound from inside. The noise was faint, almost imperceptible, but he could have sworn he heard light footsteps or the dragging of an object. His heart pounded in his chest, and he was about to give up when he noticed something even stranger: a key lying on the floor near the door. He picked it up, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. Before he could decide what to do, the sound of approaching footsteps made him quickly pocket the key and step away. Ethan returned to his room, his mind racing with questions. What were Charlotte and her staff hiding? Why did he feel like an outsider in a place that was, technically, supposed to be his temporary home? He knew he needed answers, but he also understood that the mansion harbored secrets that might be dangerous to uncover. The following night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The key he had found near the locked door seemed to burn in his pocket, as if it carried a weight far greater than its size. Slowly, he got out of bed, slipped on his shoes, and decided he had to know what lay behind that door. He moved through the corridors carefully, shadows flickering on the walls under the dim glow of the lamps. The mansion's silence was broken only by the pounding of his heart. When he reached the door, he checked the hallway around him. It was completely deserted. Taking the key from his pocket, he inserted it into the lock. At first, the key wouldn't turn, as if it were stuck. With a bit more force, it finally gave way, and the lock opened with an audible click. Ethan held his breath and stepped inside. The room's interior was surprisingly well organized, but carried an eerie sense of abandonment. Piles of papers were scattered across a large wooden desk, along with folders and labeled boxes. A worn leather armchair faced a window covered by heavy curtains. On the wall hung a large portrait of a man in an old-fashioned uniform, likely Charlotte's late husband. Ethan approached the desk, feeling like he was intruding on something deeply personal, but his curiosity drove him forward. He flipped through one of the folders and found documents with his grandfather's name, Charles Carter, repeated multiple times. There were contracts, financial statements, and letters, all indicating that he and Charlotte's husband had been involved in business together. What caught Ethan's attention the most was a handwritten note attached to one of the pages. Charles knew the risks. He always knew. The sound of a creak in the hallway made him freeze. He quickly turned off the light and remained still, listening to the faint footsteps approaching. The door opened slowly, and a figure stepped in. Ethan could barely make out the face in the dark before hearing a familiar voice. It was James. "What are you doing here?" The butler's voice was firm but not hostile. Ethan tried to justify himself. "I needed to know. Charlotte isn't being honest with me. These papers, my grandfather. There's something she's hiding, something that involves my family." James sighed and closed the door behind him. "You shouldn't be here, but since you are, maybe it's time you learned the truth." Ethan stared at him, surprised. "What truth?" James hesitated, as if weighing the consequences of speaking. "Your grandfather and Charlotte's husband were business partners, but also enemies. Charles Carter made choices that ruined many lives, including Charlotte's. This marriage isn't just about money or convenience. It's her way of keeping you close, and perhaps settling old scores." James's words hit Ethan like a bombshell. The room seemed to spin, and the questions that had plagued him only multiplied. Before he could form a response, James placed a hand on his shoulder. "But be careful. Charlotte neither forgives nor forgets. If you want to know more, you must tread lightly. Any misstep could be costly." With that, James left the room, leaving Ethan in both literal and figurative darkness. He knew he couldn't go back to his room yet. His mind swirled with the new revelations, and he was more determined than ever to uncover the full truth. The next morning, Ethan woke early, still consumed by the events of the previous night. He decided it was time to confront Charlotte. He needed clear answers without evasion. Dressing quickly, he made his way to the main hall, where he found Charlotte sitting serenely, a cup of tea in front of her as she read the morning paper. The contrast between her calm demeanor and Ethan's inner turmoil was almost surreal. "We need to talk," he announced, stopping a few steps away from her. Charlotte raised her eyes above the newspaper, studying him with a calculating gaze before folding the paper with precision. "Agreed. But what exactly is troubling you so early, Ethan? I know that my grandfather and your husband had business dealings. I know that what's happening here has nothing to do with me, but somehow, I'm caught in the middle of it. Why didn't you tell me everything from the start?" Charlotte set her teacup on its saucer with a controlled movement, the sound echoing in the silent hall. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table and clasping her hands together. "And what exactly do you think you know, Ethan?" "That this isn't just about a simple marriage contract," he replied, trying to sound confident despite his nerves. "James told me that my grandfather ruined the lives of many people, that this is more personal than you're willing to admit. So why me? Why this elaborate game?" Charlotte let out a soft sigh, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "Yes, it is personal. Your grandfather, Charles Carter, was a brilliant man but also a manipulator. He made deals that enriched my family while simultaneously setting everything up for ruin. My husband trusted him, believed they were building something great, but in the end, Charles betrayed him. It led to the collapse of my family's business, the stress that wrecked my husband's health, and ultimately his untimely death. And you're the only heir left, the only living link to that man. This marriage was the only way I could ensure that you, at the very least, paid a small part of his debt." Her words fell on Ethan like stones, heavy and inescapable. He felt crushed by guilt, even though he knew he had no involvement in his grandfather's actions. "But I had nothing to do with that," he protested, his voice laden with indignation and sorrow. "I barely even knew him. Why should I have to pay for his mistakes?" Charlotte rose slowly, her tall, elegant figure casting a shadow over Ethan. "Do you think the world is fair, Ethan? Do you think the suffering my family endured is balanced because you're innocent? It doesn't matter if you're not to blame. You carry the Carter name, and that's enough for me. But remember this. While you're here, your sister will be safe, your debts will be paid, and your future will be secure. If you leave or decide to challenge this arrangement, well, I hope you're prepared to face the consequences." Her cold, definitive tone made Ethan shiver. He wanted to scream, to contest the cruelty of it all, but the words caught in his throat. He realized he was dealing with someone who had lost so much that concepts like fairness or justice no longer mattered. As Charlotte left the hall, leaving him alone, Ethan felt hot tears streaming down his face. He thought of Lily, the promise he had made to protect her, and the unbearable weight of a past he had never asked to inherit. In the days following his confrontation with Charlotte, Ethan began to see the mansion in a new light. Every detail, every whisper among the staff, seemed to hide something deeper, a web of secrets he was only beginning to unravel. He realized he couldn't simply accept the situation. Even though he was trapped in the arrangement, he needed to fully understand what he was up against. It was during a quiet night that James appeared again. The butler entered Ethan's room without knocking, closing the door behind him. His serious expression indicated he had something important to share. "You need to know more," James said, handing him an old, worn folder. "But be aware that if you keep digging, you'll be risking more than you realize." Ethan opened the folder and found a collection of documents and photographs. Among them were images of Charlotte's husband and Ethan's grandfather shaking hands in front of an imposing building. But what truly caught his attention were the financial records. Large sums of money were listed as transfers between the two families' businesses, most of which ended with notes about defaults or legal disputes. These records show that, in the end, your grandfather took advantage of Charlotte's husband. He embezzled funds, manipulated contracts, and left her family in ruins, James explained in a hushed voice. She was left with insurmountable debts. What you see today, this mansion, the fortune, is what she managed to rebuild on her own. But at the cost of her humanity. Ethan flipped through the papers, feeling a mix of shame and anger. It was painful to learn that his grandfather had caused so much suffering, but the thought of being forced to pay for something he hadn't done consumed him. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan asked, looking up at James. The butler hesitated for a moment before replying. "Because I've seen what Charlotte is capable of when she feels threatened. And while she pays me to be loyal, I believe you deserve to know who you're dealing with." Ethan thanked him, but the information only deepened his sense of helplessness. From that moment, he began planning his next steps. He needed support, someone who could help him navigate his way out of this situation. He called Ryan, his lawyer friend, and arranged a meeting outside the mansion, something he knew was risky but necessary. During their meeting at a discreet cafe in the city center, Ethan shared everything he had discovered. Ryan listened attentively, taking notes and examining the documents Ethan had brought with him. "This is serious, Ethan," Ryan said after a long silence. "These documents could be evidence against her, but they're also dangerous for you. If she finds out you're investigating, she might retaliate. Charlotte clearly isn't someone who takes being challenged lightly. I know, but I can't just stand still. I need to protect Lily and find a way out of this without putting anyone else at risk." Ryan nodded thoughtfully. "I'll help you, but we'll need more evidence, something that directly ties Charlotte to the illegal schemes you've mentioned. And you'll need to be incredibly careful. Charlotte won't go down without a fight." Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders at his friend's promise of support, but he knew the path ahead would be treacherous. He returned to the mansion that night with a renewed sense of determination, though fully aware he was treading on increasingly unstable ground. The following weeks became a dangerous game of patience and caution for Ethan. He followed Ryan's instructions, discreetly gathering information while observing Charlotte and her staff. Every night presented an opportunity to explore another corner of the mansion or to review the documents James had provided. Yet he knew he was walking a tightrope, always under watchful eyes. Charlotte seemed to notice something. Though she made no direct comments, her glances toward Ethan lingered longer, as if she were trying to read his thoughts. She maintained their interactions as professional and distant as ever, but at times, it felt like she was gauging how much he might know. One night, while searching through Charlotte's office for more evidence, Ethan stumbled upon something that left him stunned. A folder labeled with his name. Inside, he found detailed reports about his life before the marriage, photos of him and Lily, financial records, and even collection letters he thought had been discarded. At the center of it all was a copy of the marriage contract, but this one had handwritten annotations by Charlotte. Words like control and strategy were scrawled in the margins, hinting that the marriage was part of a much larger plan than he had imagined. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Ethan freeze. He quickly stuffed the documents back into the folder, turned off the light, and hid behind a bookshelf as the office door opened. Charlotte entered, accompanied by James. "He's hiding something," Charlotte said, her voice cold and calculated, "and I want you to find out what it is. He cannot be underestimated, even if he appears naive." "I'm certain Ethan is investigating something he shouldn't." James remained silent, but the tension in the room was palpable. Ethan could feel his pulse racing, knowing he couldn't let Charlotte suspect that James had already shared information with him. When they finally left the room, Ethan waited a few minutes before emerging from his hiding spot and retreating to his room, his heart pounding in his chest. The next morning, Ethan found James in the garden, watering the plants with his usual calm expression. He approached slowly, trying to gauge whether the butler's loyalty still held true. "She suspects," Ethan said quietly. James nodded, not looking directly at him. "Charlotte is a born strategist. She never fully trusts anyone. That's why you need to be careful. She won't hesitate to act if she perceives you as a threat." Ethan considered his words carefully, but he knew he had already passed the point of no return. Later that day, he managed to send a copy of the new documents to Ryan, who promised to review them thoroughly. Every move now felt like a step closer to the truth or a potential catastrophe. As night fell, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Charlotte's behavior had become increasingly unpredictable, and the mansion felt more suffocating than ever. He knew the time to act was drawing near, but he wasn't sure how prepared he was for what lay ahead. That evening, Charlotte hosted a formal dinner at the mansion, something that rarely occurred. High-profile guests began to arrive, figures from the worlds of business and politics. Ethan was informed that his presence was required, and although he loathed the idea of participating in an event clearly designed to strengthen Charlotte's connections with powerful people, he knew he couldn't refuse. Dressed in an elegant suit she had chosen for him, Ethan descended the grand staircase to the main hall. The space had been transformed, glowing under the light of chandeliers and adorned with exotic flowers. The low hum of conversations filled the air, carrying an undercurrent of power and collusion. Charlotte was at the center of it all, moving gracefully between the guests with calculated poise, her cold smile never faltering. Ethan felt out of place in the scene. He was introduced to some of the guests as "my husband," a phrase Charlotte delivered with a slight undertone of sarcasm, as if his role there was nothing more than another pawn in her game. He tried to engage politely, but his mind was racing, searching for clues that might unravel more of her secrets. Midway through the dinner, as the exquisitely prepared courses were being served, Ethan noticed a man seated beside Charlotte. He was an older gentleman with gray hair, a serious demeanor, and sharp eyes that seemed to scrutinize every detail of the room. They spoke in hushed tones, but Ethan managed to catch a few words that set his nerves on edge. Transfers, old documents, and unnecessary risk. When Charlotte stepped away momentarily, Ethan saw an opportunity. He approached the man, trying to appear casual. "Sorry to interrupt. I'm Ethan, Charlotte's husband." The man studied him for a moment before replying in a raspy voice. "Ah, of course. I've heard quite a bit about you. I hope it's been good things," Ethan said, forcing a smile. "That depends on who's telling the story," the man responded enigmatically. Before Ethan could ask anything further, Charlotte returned, placing a possessive hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, dear, you shouldn't bother our guests with questions." Her tone was polite, but the underlying message was unmistakable. She steered him back toward another group of people, making it clear she was keeping a close watch on his every move. As the guests began to disperse, Ethan realized the dinner had served a greater purpose. Spotting James in the kitchen gathering glasses, he approached discreetly. Who was the man sitting next to Charlotte? The one with gray hair. James hesitated before answering. "Leonard Cray. He's one of the few who knows the truth about her past. He was involved in the business dealings with your grandfather and her husband. If he's here, it means something significant is in motion." The revelation unsettled Ethan. Leonard seemed to be a key figure in unraveling the web of secrets Charlotte had built. However, approaching him without raising suspicion would be a challenge. That night, in the silence of his room, Ethan reflected on what he had learned. He needed more information, but Leonard's presence indicated that Charlotte was moving quickly to secure her interests. Time was running out, and he knew the next step would be critical. In the days following the dinner, Ethan carefully considered his options. Leonard Cray's presence had set off alarm bells. Ethan knew the man wasn't there just for socializing. His connection to Charlotte's and Charles Carter's past made him a pivotal figure in a game Ethan still didn't fully understand. Determined to act, Ethan found another opportunity to speak with James. The butler, though hesitant, revealed another layer of the story. Leonard wasn't just an associate. He had been the intermediary in numerous deals between Charles Carter and Charlotte's husband. It was possible he had knowledge of documents that could incriminate Charlotte and even expose crimes that were still active. Ethan realized that the key to bringing Charlotte down was getting information directly from Leonard. But the question was how to do it without Charlotte finding out. He decided a distraction was necessary. The following night, while Charlotte was occupied with a call in her office, Ethan took advantage of her absence to seek out Leonard. He knew the man was still staying at the mansion, likely in the guest room in the south wing. Walking softly through the dimly lit corridors, Ethan reached Leonard's door and knocked gently. Leonard opened the door with a cautious expression. "Ethan, what do you want?" "I need to talk. It's important," Ethan replied, his voice firm but calm. Leonard observed him for a moment before opening the door wider and letting him in. The room was opulently decorated, like the rest of the mansion, but the atmosphere was tense. Leonard gestured toward a chair while he sat down in the armchair nearby. "So, what brings you here, young Carter?" Ethan took a deep breath before speaking. "I know you were involved in my grandfather's and Charlotte's husband's business dealings, and I know something is very wrong here. I need your help to understand what's really at stake." Leonard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're brave, Ethan, or very naive. Whatever Charlotte has told you, it's only a fraction of the truth. She plays a dangerous game, but I'm sure you already know that." "Then tell me the truth," Ethan insisted, his determination clear in his eyes. Leonard sighed, picking up a glass of whiskey from the table beside him. "Charlotte and her husband built their fortune in part thanks to your grandfather. But he wasn't innocent. Charles Carter knew exactly what he was getting into, and when things started to go wrong, he pulled back, leaving the Hayes to deal with the fallout alone. It ruined her husband, and Charlotte, well, she was shaped by that betrayal. What she's doing now is ensuring that none of it ever comes back to haunt her. And frankly, she's very good at it." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. Leonard was confirming what he already suspected. Charlotte was dangerous. But his words also hinted that there was more Ethan didn't yet understand. "Are there any proofs she's still involved in illegal schemes?" Ethan asked. Leonard stared at him with piercing eyes, as if deciding whether he could trust him. Finally, he replied, "There are. But if you think you'll walk away from this unscathed, you're fooling yourself. Charlotte doesn't leave loose ends." Before Ethan could press further, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Leonard quickly stood and motioned for Ethan to leave through a side door in the room that led to a service staircase. "Go. And remember, watch every step you take." Ethan hurried out, his heart pounding. He knew he was closing in on something big, but he also felt the looming presence of Charlotte more than ever. After his conversation with Leonard, Ethan felt closer than ever to uncovering the secrets surrounding Charlotte. However, the tension in the mansion seemed to grow. Charlotte, more suspicious than ever, spent most of her time secluded in her office, while the staff seemed even more cautious around Ethan. James, though maintaining a professional demeanor, avoided unnecessary interactions with him, as if trying to protect both himself and Ethan from potential consequences. Ethan, in turn, began to act with even greater caution. He knew that any misstep could alert Charlotte to his plans, but it didn't stop him from continuing his investigation. On a particularly silent night, he decided to explore the safe he had seen in Charlotte's office during one of his earlier incursions. He was certain the most crucial information would be there. He waited until the hallway lights were turned off and, with measured steps, crossed the mansion to the office. The door was unlocked, as if Charlotte hadn't imagined anyone would dare violate the sanctity of that space. With a soft click, Ethan closed the door behind him and turned on the small flashlight he had brought with him. The safe was embedded in the wall behind a bookshelf, and he began rifling through drawers and cabinets, searching for a clue to the code. After what felt like hours, he found a small notebook filled with Charlotte's notes. Among seemingly random phrases and numbers, a specific sequence of digits caught his attention, marked with a subtle annotation. Remember, he entered the numbers into the safe's keypad, and, to his relief, the mechanism clicked, indicating success. When he opened the safe, he found a series of neatly organized folders, a stack of cash, and a small jewelry box. Ignoring the valuables, Ethan pulled out the folders and began flipping through them. One contained a list of recent financial transactions, clearly fraudulent. Names, account numbers, and amounts screamed illegality, and he knew immediately that this was what Ryan needed to take action. Another folder revealed something even more disturbing: a collection of contracts linking shell companies to Leonard Cray, Charlotte, and even names unfamiliar to Ethan. It appeared to be a complex web of illicit business dealings that went beyond personal vengeance. It was a clandestine empire built on corruption. As he combed through the documents, a sound behind him made his heart leap. He turned quickly and saw Charlotte standing in the doorway, her silhouette illuminated by the light from the hallway. "I knew you were curious, Ethan, but I didn't think you'd be this reckless," she said, her voice calm but laced with a menacing edge. Ethan tried to hide the papers behind his back, but Charlotte stepped forward, closing the door. "Did you really think you could play detective without facing consequences? I just want to understand why you dragged me into this." "I want to know the truth," Ethan replied, trying to keep his voice steady even though his body was taut with tension. Charlotte crossed her arms, looking at him with a mix of disappointment and something that resembled regret. "The truth is, your grandfather destroyed lives, including mine. And you, dear Ethan, are my insurance against anything that threatens everything I've rebuilt. But I warned you not to cross certain lines. Now, I'll have to decide what to do with you." Ethan realized he was in real danger, but he also knew he couldn't show vulnerability. "If anything happens to me, these documents go straight to the police. You can control me here, but you can't control everything." Charlotte remained silent for a few seconds, studying him. Then, she gave a faint smile. "You're smarter than you look. But be careful, Ethan. I'm still the most powerful piece in this game." She turned and left the office, leaving him alone with the unmistakable sense that the battle between them had reached a breaking point. Ethan gathered the documents he'd managed to collect and returned to his room, resolute in his decision to share everything with Ryan as soon as possible. He knew there was no more time to waste. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. The confrontation with Charlotte had made it clear that time was running out. Every step he took in search of answers brought him closer to danger, but also closer to the truth. He knew he had to act before Charlotte made her next move. As the sun began to rise, Ethan called Ryan and arranged an urgent meeting. Ryan met him at a small cafe in the city center, a location Ethan had chosen to avoid attracting attention. He handed his friend the folder containing the documents from the safe. Ryan examined them carefully, his expression growing more serious with each page. "Ethan, this is bigger than I thought. These transactions, the contracts, the accounts. If this gets into the right hands, Charlotte and everyone involved could be indicted for a slew of financial crimes. But you understand what this means, right? If she finds out you've passed this on to me, you'll be in serious danger." "I'm already in danger," Ethan replied firmly. "She knows I'm investigating. What matters now is ensuring she doesn't get away with this." Ryan nodded, tucking the documents into his briefcase. "I'll contact someone I know in the prosecutor's office. They can offer protection for you and your sister if this escalates." The mention of Lily made Ethan's chest tighten. He didn't want his sister dragged into the chaos, but he knew his actions could inevitably affect her. He trusted Ryan, But he was also aware that Charlotte was powerful and unpredictable. Back at the mansion, Ethan tried to act as though nothing had happened, but the tension in the air was palpable. Charlotte was more reserved than ever, avoiding direct interactions with him. However, there was something in her behavior that suggested she was planning something. That evening, a formal event was scheduled to take place at the mansion, a grand cocktail party with investors and influential political figures in attendance. Charlotte seemed determined to reinforce her image as a powerful, untouchable woman. For Ethan, it presented a unique opportunity. He knew this could be the perfect moment to expose her secrets once and for all. Ethan contacted Ryan, and together they devised a plan. Ryan would send a group of journalists and police officers to the event, armed with the evidence Ethan had gathered. The objective was clear: catch Charlotte off guard and ensure the accusations were made public before she could retaliate. When the night of the event arrived, Ethan donned the suit Charlotte had provided and descended to the grand hall, where guests were already mingling. The atmosphere was both luxurious and oppressive, filled with false laughter and conversations layered with subtext. Charlotte, dressed in an impeccable black gown, moved gracefully among the attendees with her usual calculated poise. Ethan stayed on the sidelines, waiting for the right moment to act. He knew the final confrontation was imminent and that, once everything was revealed, nothing would ever be the same. Suddenly, he noticed a commotion at the entrance of the mansion. Journalists began pouring in, followed by police officers with stern, resolute expressions. The hall, once filled with pleasant murmurs, was now alive with confused glances and hushed questions. Charlotte, sensing the shift in atmosphere, immediately turned to Ethan, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and realization. "You dared," she began, striding toward him with deliberate steps. Ethan held his ground, even though his heart was pounding. "This had to happen. You know that?" Charlotte stopped just a few feet from him, her face a mask of impenetrable coldness. "You've made a mistake, Ethan. A mistake that will cost you dearly." Before she could say more, one of the officers approached, asking her to accompany them to clarify the accusations. Charlotte raised her chin with defiance but did not resist. As she was escorted out of the hall, the flash of cameras illuminated her face, capturing the image of a woman who, even when cornered, refused to show weakness. Ethan watched the scene with a mixture of relief and sadness. He knew he had done the right thing, but he couldn't shake the emptiness he felt as he watched her being taken away. The war was ending, but its scars would remain. The days following Charlotte's arrest felt like a storm slowly dissipating, leaving behind an eerie silence. Ethan returned to the house he and Lily had lived in before it all began. With Ryan's help, he managed to settle the debts that had plagued his family, using part of the recovered funds from Charlotte's illicit transactions. The house, though modest, felt like a safe haven after the dark months spent in the mansion. Lily, now receiving proper medical treatment, was slowly regaining her energy, and the smile Ethan had feared was lost forever. He spent more time with her, cherishing simple moments like cooking dinner together or watching old movies on TV. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan could breathe without the constant weight of fear and uncertainty. However, the impact of his experience with Charlotte didn't fade entirely. Ethan was often haunted by memories of the mansion, the secrets he uncovered, and the difficult choices he had been forced to make. Even so, he used the pain as fuel for something greater. With the remaining portion of the recovered funds, he founded an organization dedicated to helping victims of financial fraud, providing both legal and psychological support. He named it the Carter Hayes Foundation, a deliberate choice to symbolize both his family's legacy and Charlotte's. The foundation quickly became a beacon of transformation and justice. A few weeks after the foundation's launch, Ethan received a letter. The envelope was plain, but as he opened it, he recognized Charlotte's elegant handwriting. The letter, written with an unexpectedly sincere tone, began with an apology. "Ethan, I don't expect you to understand, and even less to forgive me. But I want you to know that, in the end, I realized my thirst for revenge had turned me into the very thing I despised most. When I lost my husband and my son, I also lost the part of myself that knew how to move forward. I used you as a tool, but ironically, it was your courage that made me see the emptiness I had created for myself. I am at peace with my punishment, but I want something good to come from all of this. I've left a considerable portion of my estate in your name. Use it wisely, as I know you will. The rest remains reserved for me, should I ever have the opportunity to rebuild my life. I hope you find the happiness that always seemed out of reach for me. Charlotte Hayes. Ethan read the letter several times, each word resonating with a weight he couldn't quite describe. He felt a mixture of compassion and sadness. Charlotte was both a victim and a villain, trapped in a cycle of pain that he had managed to break only at the last moment. In the months that followed, the foundation grew, helping countless families rebuild their lives. Ethan began giving lectures on ethics and responsibility in the business world, using his own story as an example of how mistakes could ripple across generations. He found purpose in turning his pain and his family's past mistakes into something meaningful. Though Charlotte remained in prison, Ethan knew her story would shape him forever. The mansion, the secrets, the contract, all of it was now a part of who he was. But instead of being defined by it, he chose to use it as a starting point for a new life. At the end of a long day at the foundation, Ethan sat on the couch beside Lily. She was laughing at a scene in a movie, and he realized something simple yet profound. The promise he had made to himself to protect her had been fulfilled. For the first time, he felt that both of them were truly free. If you enjoyed this video, let us know in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe. A big hug, and see you in the next video.